Right, so Israel's missile strikes on Iran have shaken the world with the sheer destructiveness and scale of those attacks, but also the unhinged attitude of Benjamin Netanyahu, a completely unprovoked and illegal stunt as this was. And it's triggered not just a mixed bag of coverage depending on where you look, but also a lot of questions too, and not all of them are being answered either, certainly not by mainstream media. Though even there's been a little bit of a shift in positioning for some rather surprising sources at that. For how long is the question. But what was the remit in Israeli heads for this strike? What was the justification? And why now? And what are we getting told versus the actual truth of the matter? Because it must be said, the strikes have had a disturbingly mixed response from media and global leaders alike. Where Israel's attack has zero basis in fact or justification, that hasn't stopped some from trying. It should be an open and shut, clear-cut case of military action carried out illegally, and the fact it isn't being done so in that way is both terrifying and extremely dangerous. Where support for Israel still comes from vested interests and bought and paid for political figures, we're all getting pushed towards the unthinkable as the international global order those same leaders claim to stand for crumbles around them, while they say this is fine. Because by standing by Israel, they make clear they don't do anything of the sort, do they? And in fact expose themselves in some of the most ridiculous but also dangerous ways they possibly can.
Richard, how do you assess what Israel has done in the last 24 hours?
It's an illegal aggression, unprovoked, with a flimsy excuse that somehow Iran has changed its recent policy towards moving actually towards a nuclear weapon. There's no evidence available widely for that. Israel has inflicted very serious damage on Iran. It's not clear how far Iran will be able to retaliate. It's not clear whether the United States, which is clearly a 100% supporter of this action by Israel, will be able to stay out of the conflict. It's not clear whether Iran will stay within the non-proliferation treaty or withdraw from it in response to this aggression. Nor is it clear yet whether the world economy will escape a hit from action in retaliation against the oil trade out of the Persian Gulf.
Okay.
What we can say is that it's unlikely to end soon.
Yes. Well, I mean, Anel, you know, Israel would say, of course, that the IAEA made it clear that Iran was no longer in compliance with its nuclear program, and that is the trigger for these attacks. Why is that not justifiable?
The determination was not that Iran had actually started to move towards a weapon. I think the real issue here is the U.S. role and the fact that Trump campaigned on saying he was not going to get the U.S. into any more wars, and he seems to think that by allowing Israel to take this position and strike Iran, this is somehow facilitating the nuclear deal and the negotiations, when in fact this almost automatically leads to escalation and leads to war, unfortunately. Either Iran is retaliating now and the U.S. is likely to get involved and counterattack on Israel's behalf, or alternatively, if Iran proves really incapable of mounting a significant attack, Israel is likely to keep on hitting it, and the result is what? The Iranian regime falls and then the region descends into chaos? I mean, in neither way is Trump able to maintain this position that he was going to keep the United States out of the Middle East and out of these unnecessary wars. But instead what we've seen is similar to what happened to Biden. Netanyahu has dragged Trump into exactly the position he campaigned against. And so, I mean, moving forward, my hope is that the American people will speak out against this and say America has no role to play here in trying to assist illegal Israeli aggression against Iran.
We've been tracking it for years. We've been warning for years. Our partners around the world, our counterparts, different governments, including the UK, about this Iranian threat that is a threat for the world, not just for Israel. And in recent months, we have seen them make concrete moves, which creates an immediate, imminent threat, specifically on us, but not just on us, but when they claim, that they say death to Israel, they also say death to England, they also say death to America.
Sure. Let me read you a quote from Tulsi Gabbard, the US Director of National Intelligence, because she said only on the 23rd of March, the intelligence community continues to assess that Iran is not building a nuclear weapon, and the Supreme Leader has not authorized the nuclear weapons program he suspended back in 2003. Isn't the truth of it that Benjamin Netanyahu has always wanted to eradicate Iran's nuclear program? He's talked about it for over 3 decades. It's not about a risk to Israel or its fight for survival. That is an exaggeration. This has always been his obsession.
Well, I have this privilege of wearing uniform, which is a privilege of itself, but also it means I don't have to speak about politicians because that's not my job. But I can speak on the facts on the ground. I've also
sure, but you just repeated exactly the reasoning that he gave for those strikes, and I'm suggesting to you and quoting to you what the US National Intelligence Director is saying about the level of imminent threat. It is not there.
So I will answer you to the facts, and again. We have seen intelligence. We have shared it with our different partners around the world, different governments and intelligence organizations around the world. Just 2 days ago, the International Committee in charge of looking over the nuclear sites in Iran put out the statement saying that Iran has breached all the terms of what they're supposed to do and what they're supposed to not to do. So I think, I don't know what you're referring to, but I think it's very clear for us.
Well, I read out the direct quote from Tulsi Gabbard.
Right, so that was a contrast of clips there, since being spoken by the former UK ambassador to Iran, Richard Dalton, on the inexcusability of Israel's strikes on Iran, alongside Anel Shalin of the US think tank the Quincy Institute, dropping the Trump administration in it for good measure for their part in this, not to mention Trump's delusions that this gives him a better hand with an Iranian nuclear deal, when it in fact will simply drive Iran to walk away and even start developing the very thing they are accused of developing already, bringing us onto the clip of the floundering IDF spokesman there, trying to defend an idea that Netanyahu has been peddling without evidence for over 30 years, that being the Iranian development of a nuclear weapon. It's very noticeable who is on the side of what is right and honest and who is struggling to defend the indefensible. And again, we see Channel 4 there highlighting sane voices. But even the BBC have now put an Israeli spokesperson on the spot. I wonder if that host will still be employed for very much longer, is the automatic thought that springs to mind. But given other news anchors have lost their jobs for daring challenge the Israeli official line, it's not beyond the realms of possibility he's about to get his P45. However, there is no doubting that the Israeli military's recent strikes on Iran have shocked and appalled the world. Unless you're a Zionist, of course, in which case there's no saving you. Not merely for their destructiveness, but for what they symbolise. The unravelling of diplomacy, the rise of even more deranged rogue state behaviour, and the potential ignition of a regional or even a global war as more nations get dragged in proactively, including those who have been involved but operated behind the scenes. With the launch of this unprovoked offensive, Benjamin Netanyahu has proven beyond doubt that his removal from power is a global necessity, that he is nothing but an unhinged ideologue clinging to power through perpetual conflict, and the more trouble he ends up getting in at home, the more war he is prepared to make to try and get himself out of it. Western leaders, many of whom claim to support international law, have again betrayed those ideals by offering words of support or calculated silence as Netanyahu steers the world towards catastrophe, one more nation and one more subservient global leader at a time. As we know, in the early hours of yesterday morning, Israeli forces carried out that coordinated strike on Iran's nuclear infrastructure and military command centres, killing at least 86 and injuring 341 according to subsequent reports. The Iranian retaliation, though swift and damaging, caused significantly fewer casualties as it happens, 2 deaths and 19 injuries, highlighting not only the imbalance of aggression and the more careful selection of targets, especially since Iran did absolutely hammer Tel Aviv afterwards, cutting through the Iron Dome defences like they weren't even there, but also the sheer scale and contrast of Israel's provocation. For months, Israeli officials and media outlets have laid the groundwork for this escalation against Israel, especially after the attacks mounted last year by recycling an old and largely debunked narrative that Iran is on the verge of developing nuclear weapons. This fear-mongering is not new. It dates back for decades and has never materialised into anything like a verifiable threat. Richard Dalton, as seen in that clip a moment ago, reaffirmed that Israel's claims about an imminent Iranian nuclear weapon remain entirely unfounded. and that this strike on Iran was not only unjustified, but also flagrantly illegal under international law. That Israel has nuclear weapons and refuses to sign the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT, while Iran remains a signatory, for now at least, and allows inspections, underlines the deep hypocrisy. According to Tulsi Gabbard, as pointed out by the BBC a moment ago in that clip, no credible evidence has ever demonstrated that Iran is developing nuclear weapons. And the recent reports made by the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, that after 20 years Iran are all of a sudden now just ahead of this attack, that had apparently been planned for the last 8 months, incidentally, no longer are compliant, just stinks of being leaned on by somebody, be that Israel or the US, or perhaps both, maybe somebody else entirely. But for over 8 months, this attack had been planned by Mossad, indicating that Netanyahu's government had no intention of pursuing peace. Bear in mind that this means that this attack was still being planned even as ceasefires were put into place and were being negotiated and enacted in Gaza earlier this year. War with Iran was already inked on Israel's calendar whilst all of that was going on, therefore. So the notion that this attack was a sudden preemptive measure because Iran were just on the verge of successfully developing a nuclear weapon, as that IDF spokesperson said, is just complete nonsense. It is a myth meant to distract from the long-term calculated aggression that Israel has enacted on Gaza and elsewhere, now that those moves are destroying Israel's reputation on what is left of it globally. So even more war is Netanyahu's answer to save himself again. At what point does he actually stop, folks? How much war and destruction is going to be too much for him? This is a guy, frankly, who is so unhinged that as long as he gets to sit on a throne and wear a crown, in effect, he'd happily preside over a pile of ashes if that's all that's left. If Netanyahu's regime is guilty of igniting this conflict in Iran, though, Western powers are utterly complicit in enabling it. Despite denying military involvement, several leaders were notified in advance. Not only were Donald Trump and German Chancellor Friedrich Merz briefed ahead of the attack, as came out yesterday, but since then it's come out the UK leader Keir Starmer and Foreign Secretary David Lammy were also informed ahead of the strikes. That knowledge and their subsequent failure to act also amounts to tacit approval, and indeed all Starmer could muster to say yesterday was concern over what was being seen that both sides need to de-escalate. So Iran doesn't have a right to defend itself then. Israel did, didn't it?
I'm very clear. Israel does have that right to defend herself, and Hamas bears responsibility.
A siege is appropriate? Cutting off power, cutting off water? Sakir?
Well, I think that Israel does have that right. It is an ongoing situation. Obviously, everything should be done within international law, but I don't want to step away from the sort of core principles that Israel has a right to defend herself and Hamas bears responsibility for these terrorist acts. And I would call on all responsible states, particularly Middle East responsible states, to call this out for what it is, and to stand with the world in utterly condemning these actions by Hamas.
I will never stop sharing that clip until he finally stands up and apologises for that. Donald Trump's duplicity here and now, though, deserves particular scrutiny. While posturing as a peacemaker president as he's been doing, the toxic tangerine was imploring Israel not to attack Iran just a day before the strikes, only for it to then emerge that he had full prior knowledge of the offensive. In a staggering display of typical arrogance combined with mind-numbing stupidity, Trump has since described the Israeli attack as excellent and jeered Iran, saying they should have made a deal with him. If the vacuous fool had more than 2 brain cells fighting over third place, he'd know his actions, as Anel Shalin also made clear, it is far more likely to compel Iran to abandon the NPT altogether and begin enriching uranium for military purposes. The exact scenario everybody wanted to avoid, and Israel's decades-long lies will have ended up becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy. Western calls for restraint now come across as all the weaker, therefore, and still we have to put up with the insufferability of listening to it. Leaders like Friedrich Merz and Emmanuel Macron and Antonio Guterres and Keir Starmer continue to trot out the platitudes as cover for their own ongoing inaction, even now. They are wasting their breath on a regime that has shown time and again it will not be restrained. But when it comes to it, too many of these leaders will still side with Israel, even though this attack is based on a pack of lies. Netanyahu's legitimacy depends on endless war, and international dithering only empowers him. Contrast that with the response from countries like Turkey or Qatar or Oman or Iraq, arguably being that much closer to Israel and Iran. This is seen as an immediate threat now, which issued swift and unequivocal condemnations of Israel's aggression. Armed groups like Hezbollah or the Houthis in Yemen have also weighed in condemning Israel, underscoring the dangerous escalation point at which the Middle East now stands, with all of these other state actors fearing they could soon be dragged into this, willingly or not. Alternatively, other nations in the region, like Jordan and Saudi Arabia, had roles in assisting Israel by intercepting Iranian drone retaliations and allowing Israel to use their airspace, making it clear they have chosen a side already and is not one of peace if they're standing with Netanyahu. Their de facto alliance, out of loyalty or out of fear, whatever, with Israel won't be forgotten by regional powers or their own populations. The particularly pathetic response from the German Foreign Office deserves singling out, though, which was brilliantly summed up by Greek economist Yanis Varoufakis. The German Foreign Ministry's statement is almost comical. Israel attacked, Iran responded, we condemn Iran. Yes, they condemned Iran for defending itself while affirming their support for Israel as they launched an unprovoked attack on another sovereign state. Will Germany ever not be on the wrong side of history? And it perfectly encapsulates the moral bankruptcy at the heart of so much of Western diplomacy today. This is what happens when decades of impunity are granted to a nuclear-armed aggressor. The rules-based international order just becomes a hollow slogan. It's impossible to separate this attack from Israel's deeper strategic insecurities. One of the primary motivations for the strike was Israel's fear that the US might eventually allow Iran to enrich uranium for domestic energy purposes, a right it does hold under the NPT. That Israel finds even peaceful nuclear development by Iran intolerable, it's their own problem, but it says far more about their own paranoia than any real threat too. But also the hypocrisy when they themselves have nuclear weapons, that they won't sign the NPT and they won't allow nuclear site inspections, all of which Iran do. The attack on Iran by Israel is a global indictment of a policy of appeasement. For decades, the West has showered Israel with military aid and political protection and rhetorical cover, encouraging behaviour that has now spiralled entirely out of control. Netanyahu's latest war gambit is the natural result of a system that's never held him accountable. He is a genocidal toddler with too many toys and not enough discipline. And he's still not finished. Both Israel and Iran, as well as Trump himself, have warned that more attacks are coming. The region is already on edge from the genocide and strikes in Gaza and Syria and Yemen, and this is now being driven towards a full-blown regional conflict. Netanyahu's obsession with destroying Iran's nuclear capabilities, real or imagined, has turned the Middle East into a powder keg. Even mainstream Western media, which usually marches in lockstep with government narratives, are beginning to sound the alarm too. Recent headlines include Benjamin Netanyahu must be stopped, coming from, of all places, The Guardian, and why Israel's attack on Iran proves Netanyahu is an unhinged messiah from The Independent might herald a bit of a shift, though I'm a long way from being confident in that, of course. The Guardian has been one of the biggest shills for Israel and Zionism going in the UK. For them to have turned their back on that will, well, take more than one or two articles, frankly. But they won't want to be seen as hypocrites swinging both ways either at a time like this. These rare ruptures in the propaganda, especially when you consider the amount Israel invests globally in Hezbollah, in their propaganda movement, must be seized upon to generate public pressure for a drastic shift in policy. The US complicity is also becoming impossible to deny and goes even deeper than first thought too. You see, it's now also emerged that Trump approved the transfer of hundreds of Hellfire missiles to Israel just prior to these attacks. The allegation being that this was done knowing that they would be used against Iran too. It would be so typical of Trump, and it makes every subsequent American call for restraint an even bigger grotesque joke than it was before. Because, after all, without the US, Israel will not have any bombs to carry on making the war with that it keeps doing. Iran's UN envoy Amir Saeed Iravani has called the Israeli attack a direct consequence of the world's inactions and double standards as well. And he's completely right. When Russia invaded Ukraine, the world responded with swift sanctions, moral outrage, and united action, didn't it? Yet Israel can bomb Lebanon and Syria and Gaza and the West Bank and Yemen, and now we're on to Iran, with impunity. Some states are allowed to do as they like, but others are not. But karma has a habit of catching up with poor politics and the poor politicians behind it. The oil markets are already reacting to this mess, with increased volatility due to fears of prolonged conflict. Every drone strike, every retaliatory missile pushes the world closer to a global economic crisis as well as a bigger military one. The consequences of inaction and of complicity and of hand-wringing reticence will be felt in energy bills and food prices and lost lives. And still, the UK, for its part, continues to train Israeli soldiers on British soil, soldiers who may well return to the Middle East to escalate these tensions even further. There's been no effort to halt this training, no reconsideration of diplomatic or military ties. If not for the Iranian retaliation, no doubt the daily spy flights over Gaza for Israel would have continued flying from RAF Akrotiri. The silence is damning. But perhaps most grotesque of all is the personal cowardice of Benjamin Netanyahu. As Iranian retaliation loomed, reports indicated he fled to Greece aboard his luxury Wing of Zion plane, abandoning his own people to face the consequences of his own belligerence. This is the man for whom Western leaders are offering cover, taking cover in another country as a mess of his making plays out. We are literally standing on the edge of a precipice here, watching as one single leader drags an entire region and potentially the world into chaos if something isn't done about him shortly. Netanyahu's obsession with perpetual war has now crossed every line going. This is not about security, it is not about peace, it is about the political survival of one man through utter destruction. World leaders must stop pretending Netanyahu is a rational actor. Venezuela's Nicolas Maduro, as an example, has today labelled him the Hitler of the 21st century, and those siding with him enablers of that. Strong words, yes, but it's becoming harder and harder to not see the correlation, isn't it? He is a danger to global peace and security. He must be treated as such, no ifs or buts. For more on why Israel's attack on Iran was in and of itself a fatal mistake, borne out certainly by the Iranian response, which I will cover separately, check out this video recommendation here as your suggested next watch. Please do also hit like, share and subscribe if you haven't done so already, so as to not miss out on all new daily content, as well as spreading the word and helping to support the channel at the very same time, which is very much appreciated, holding power to account for ordinary working class people, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next video. Cheers, folks.